On March 15, 2019, at exactly 11:47 a.m., Senior Auditor Benjamin Carlisle discovered that $2.3 billion had vanished from Continental Trust Bank's reserve accounts. 16 hours later, Benjamin Carlisle vanished too. The man who found the missing money became the missing man. But the truth about what happened in those crucial hours would expose a conspiracy so vast it would bring down one of America's most trusted financial institutions. Continental Trust Bank occupied 37 floors of gleaming steel and glass in downtown Chicago, a monument to financial stability that had weathered the Great Depression, the savings and loan crisis, and the 2008 financial meltdown. For 23 years, Executive Vice President Robert Sinclair had been the institution's golden boy. Harvard MBA, impeccable suits, a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, and a reputation so pristine that federal regulators often cited Continental Trust as a model of conservative banking practices. Sinclair's morning routine never varied. Arrive at 6:15 a.m. sharp, double espresso from the executive floor machine, scan the overnight reports, then conduct his daily review of the bank's position. His assistant, Patricia Reynolds, had worked for him for 14 years and could set her watch by his habits. She knew he preferred his financial reports bound in blue folders, his coffee served in the bone china cup his wife had given him for their anniversary, and his schedule managed to the minute. What Patricia didn't know was that for the past 7 years, Robert Sinclair had been systematically looting the bank he had sworn to protect. The scheme had started small, almost accidentally. In 2012, during the implementation of a new computer system, Sinclair had discovered a glitch in the overnight processing of international wire transfers. For exactly 14 minutes each night between 2:17 a.m. and 2:31 a.m. Eastern Time, the system created a vulnerability, a digital window where funds could be moved without triggering the standard audit trails. Most bankers would have reported the bug immediately. Sinclair saw opportunity. His first theft was modest. $50,000 moved from the bank's operational reserves to a shell company account in the Cayman Islands. The money was back in Continental Trust's accounts within 72 hours before any reconciliation could detect its absence. It was a test, and the system had failed spectacularly. Over the following months, Sinclair refined his technique. He created an intricate web of shell companies across 17 countries, each with legitimate-looking business purposes: import-export firms, real estate investment trusts, technology consulting companies, all of them existing only on paper, all of them controlled by Robert Sinclair through a maze of offshore entities that would make tracing ownership nearly impossible. The thefts grew bolder. $100,000 became $500,000. $500,000 became $2 million. By 2015, Sinclair was moving $10 million at a time through his network, keeping the money in motion across international borders, investing it in legitimate assets, and always ensuring that Continental Trust's books balanced by the time the quarterly audits began. He purchased a $4.2 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, under the name of one of his shell companies. His wife, Catherine, believed the house was a reward for his recent promotion to executive vice president. He bought a 47-foot yacht docked in Miami, 2 luxury cars, and a controlling interest in a boutique investment firm. To the outside world, Robert Sinclair was simply a successful banker living within his means that legitimately included a $400,000 annual salary and substantial bonuses. The beauty of Sinclair's scheme lay in its sophistication. He never stole from customer accounts, never touched deposits that belonged to individuals or businesses. Instead, he skimmed from the bank's own operational funds, reserves that were so vast, so complex in their daily movements, that his thefts appeared as nothing more than routine fluctuations in the bank's liquidity management. Continental Trust held $47 billion in assets. What was $2 billion against such a massive balance sheet? Sinclair had convinced himself he was merely borrowing against his own future earnings, that he would eventually replace every stolen dollar with interest. He had even created detailed spreadsheets showing how he would accomplish this, though he never quite got around to beginning the repayment process. By 2018, Sinclair had stolen $1.8 billion. He had grown so confident in his system, that he had begun to view the thefts as legitimate business transactions. In his private moments, he rationalized his actions with the cold logic of a man who had convinced himself that the rules simply didn't apply to him. Continental Trust was profitable, its stock price was strong, and no one had been harmed by his activities. The money was being put to better use anyway, invested in assets that generated returns rather than sitting idle in the bank's vaults. What Sinclair didn't know was that Continental Trust's board of directors had quietly commissioned an independent audit of the bank's risk management practices. The audit was routine, the kind of comprehensive review that large banks underwent every few years to satisfy regulators and investors. It was scheduled to begin on March 18, 2019, just 3 days after Benjamin Carlisle would make his devastating discovery. Benjamin Carlisle had been conducting financial audits for 11 years, but he had never worked on an account as large as Continental Trust Bank. At 34, he was the youngest senior auditor at Morrison Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm that specialized in financial services. Carlisle had earned his reputation by finding discrepancies that other auditors missed. His colleagues called him the Bloodhound for his ability to detect irregularities in even the most complex financial structures. The Continental Trust assignment was supposed to be routine. Morrison Associates had been hired to conduct a comprehensive review of the bank's operational procedures, with a particular focus on liquidity management and risk assessment. Carlisle's task was to trace the movement of funds through Continental Trust's various accounts, ensuring that the bank's reported positions matched the actual cash flows. On March 14th, Carlisle had spent the entire day reviewing Continental Trust's international wire transfer logs. The numbers were staggering. Billions of dollars moving in and out of the bank's accounts every day, a constant flow of capital that reflected the institution's role in global financial markets. Everything appeared normal, routine, exactly what one would expect from a well-managed bank. But Carlisle had learned to look beyond the obvious patterns. Late that evening, working alone in Continental Trust's audit conference room, he had begun to notice something strange about the overnight processing logs. There were gaps, small inconsistencies in the timestamps that suggested funds were being moved outside the normal processing windows. It was 11:47 a.m. on March 15th when Carlisle finally isolated the problem. Using specialized audit software, he had reconstructed the bank's overnight transactions for the previous 6 months, tracking every dollar that moved through Continental Trust's systems. What he discovered made him check his calculations 3 times before he trusted the results. $2.3 billion was missing. The money had been moved in small increments over hundreds of transactions, each one carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. The funds had been transferred to accounts in offshore jurisdictions, then immediately moved again to other accounts, creating a paper trail so complex that it would have taken months to unravel without Carlisle's specialized software. Carlisle's first instinct was to assume he had made an error. Banks didn't simply lose $2.3 billion without someone noticing. He spent the next 4 hours double-checking his work, running the analysis multiple times, searching for any explanation that didn't involve deliberate fraud. There was none. At 3:22 p.m., Carlisle picked up his phone to call his supervisor at Morrison Associates. The call that should have exposed one of the largest bank frauds in American history was never completed. As Carlisle reached for his phone, the conference room door opened. Robert Sinclair walked in. "Working late, Mr. Carlisle?" Sinclair's voice was calm, professional, exactly the tone one would expect from a senior bank executive checking on an auditor's progress. "Mr. Sinclair," Carlisle replied, his hand still reaching for the phone. "I was just about to call my office. I've found some discrepancies that need to be addressed." Sinclair closed the door behind him and moved to the chair across from Carlisle. "What kind of discrepancies?" For the next 27 minutes, the two men discussed Benjamin Carlisle's findings. Security cameras would later show Sinclair entering the conference room at 3:22 p.m. They would show him leaving alone at 3:49 p.m. Benjamin Carlisle was never seen again. When Benjamin Carlisle failed to return to his hotel that evening, His supervisor at Morrison Associates initially assumed he was working late at the bank. Carlisle was known for his dedication to completing his audits, and it wouldn't have been unusual for him to spend the night reviewing documents. By 10 a.m. on March 16th, however, Morrison Associates had become concerned. Multiple calls to Carlisle's cell phone went straight to voicemail. The hotel confirmed that he had not returned to his room. A call to Continental Trust's main number revealed that no one had seen the auditor since the previous afternoon. Patricia Reynolds, Sinclair's assistant, informed the Morrison Associates supervisor that Mr. Sinclair was attending a banking conference in New York and wouldn't be available until the following week. The supervisor requested access to the audit conference room where Carlisle had been working, but was told that the room was being used for other purposes and his materials had been secured. What Morrison Associates didn't know was that Robert Sinclair had never left Chicago. While his assistant fielded calls about the missing auditor, Sinclair was systematically destroying every trace of Benjamin Carlisle's work. The auditor's laptop was wiped clean, his printed reports were shredded, and his access to Continental Trust's computer systems was terminated. But Sinclair had made a critical error. In his haste to eliminate the evidence, he had overlooked the fact that Carlisle's audit software automatically backed up its data to Morrison Associates' secure servers every hour. Even as Sinclair was destroying the physical evidence in Chicago, a complete record of the auditor's findings was being preserved in a data center 300 miles away. The FBI became involved on March 18th when Morrison Associates reported that one of their auditors had disappeared while working at Continental Trust Bank. The initial investigation focused on the possibility that Carlisle had suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency, but that theory was abandoned when agents discovered that his rental car was still in Continental Trust's parking garage. His hotel room showed no signs of disturbance, and his credit cards hadn't been used since March 15th. Special Agent Laura Brennan had spent 8 years investigating financial crimes, and she recognized the pattern immediately. Auditors didn't simply vanish unless they had discovered something worth killing for. When she learned that Carlisle had been reviewing Continental Trust's financial records, she knew she was dealing with something far more serious than a missing person case. Brennan's first step was to secure a federal warrant for Continental Trust's financial records. The warrant was executed on March 22nd, 7 days after Carlisle's disappearance. Federal agents seized computers, documents, and backup tapes from the bank's data center, while Brennan personally interviewed every employee who had contact with the missing auditor. Robert Sinclair was interviewed on March 23rd. He was calm, professional, and deeply concerned about the missing auditor. He had spoken with Carlisle briefly on March 15th, he explained. But the conversation had been routine, just a senior executive checking on the progress of an audit. Carlisle had seemed fine, perhaps a bit tired from his long hours, but certainly not distressed or concerned about his safety. Brennan was suspicious, but she had no evidence to contradict Sinclair's story. The security cameras showed exactly what Sinclair had described: a brief meeting in the conference room, followed by Sinclair leaving alone. There was no indication of any struggle or confrontation. The breakthrough came on March 29th, when FBI computer specialists finally managed to recover the data from Benjamin Carlisle's backup files. What they found was a complete record of his analysis, including the discovery of $2.3 billion in missing funds and a detailed trace of where that money had gone. Every fraudulent transaction led back to accounts controlled by Robert Sinclair. Agent Brennan arrested Robert Sinclair at his home in Greenwich, Connecticut, at 6:15 a.m. on April 2, 2019, exactly 17 days after Benjamin Carlisle had discovered the missing money. Sinclair was in his kitchen, preparing his morning coffee with the same methodical precision he had brought to stealing $2.3 billion from Continental Trust Bank. "Robert Sinclair, you're under arrest for bank fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," Brennan announced as federal agents secured the house. "You have the right to remain silent." Sinclair's wife, Catherine, watched in shock as her husband was handcuffed in their kitchen. She had no idea that the man she had been married to for 19 years was one of the most prolific bank thieves in American history. She had no idea that their house, their cars, their lifestyle, all of it had been purchased with stolen money. Even as he was being arrested, Sinclair maintained his composure. "I want to speak with my attorney," he said calmly, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Sinclair's crimes. Over 7 years, he had stolen $2,347 billion from Continental Trust Bank, using a sophisticated network of shell companies and offshore accounts to launder the money. He had purchased real estate, luxury goods, and investments worth more than $180 million, all of it funded by his thefts from the bank. But the question that haunted investigators was more fundamental. What had happened to Benjamin Carlisle? Sinclair's lawyers advised him to remain silent, and for 6 months he did exactly that. Federal prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him of financial crimes, but without Carlisle's testimony, or his body, they couldn't prove that the missing auditor had been murdered. The case might have remained unsolved if not for a decision by Continental Trust's insurance company to conduct their own investigation. The insurance firm had paid out $2.3 billion to cover the bank's losses, and they wanted to recover as much as possible of the stolen funds. Their private investigators were more aggressive than the FBI, and they had resources that law enforcement couldn't access. In September 2019, insurance investigators discovered that Sinclair had made a significant cash withdrawal on March 16th, the day after Carlisle's disappearance. The withdrawal, $25,000 in cash, had been made from an account linked to one of his shell companies. Security cameras at the bank showed Sinclair making the withdrawal personally, despite the fact that his assistant had told Morrison Associates that he was attending a conference in New York. More damning was the discovery that Sinclair had made a series of phone calls on March 15th and 16th to a private investigator named Thomas Hatcher, a former Chicago police detective who specialized in problem resolution for wealthy clients. Hatcher had a reputation for handling situations that required discretion, and his services didn't come cheap. When federal agents questioned Hatcher, he initially denied any involvement in Carlisle's disappearance. But faced with evidence of the phone calls and the cash payment, he eventually agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. On October 14, 2019, Thomas Hatcher led FBI agents to a construction site 30 miles outside Chicago. Benjamin Carlisle's body was buried under 6 feet of concrete in what would become the foundation of a shopping mall. He had been killed with a single gunshot to the head, execution style, sometime during the evening of March 15th. Hatcher's confession was devastating. He had been hired by Sinclair to handle the auditor who had discovered the missing money. The plan had been simple: eliminate the threat, destroy the evidence, and allow Sinclair to continue his scheme indefinitely. Carlisle's murder had been cold, professional, and completely unnecessary. If Sinclair had simply allowed the audit to proceed, he might have been able to cover up his thefts long enough to flee the country. Instead, his decision to have Carlisle killed had created a federal investigation that exposed everything. The trial of Robert Sinclair began on January 6, 2020, in federal court in Chicago. The case had attracted national attention, not just because of the enormous amount of money involved, but because of the brutal murder of an innocent auditor who had simply been doing his job. Prosecutor Sandra Martinez painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life for 7 years, presenting himself as a pillar of the financial community while systematically looting the institution he had sworn to protect. Robert Sinclair didn't just steal money, Martinez told the jury during her opening statement. He stole trust, he stole security, and when Benjamin Carlisle threatened to expose his crimes, he stole a life. Sinclair's defense team, led by prominent white-collar defense attorney Michael Kramer, argued that their client was guilty of financial crimes but not murder. They maintained that Sinclair had acted alone in the embezzlement scheme and that Thomas Hatcher had killed Carlisle without authorization, hoping to curry favor with a wealthy client. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. FBI agents testified about the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that Sinclair had used to launder $2.3 billion. Computer specialists explained how he had exploited a glitch in Continental Trust's system to steal money without triggering fraud detection systems. Financial experts walked the jury through the sophisticated techniques Sinclair had used to hide his crimes for 7 years. But the most damaging testimony came from Thomas Hatcher himself. In exchange for a plea agreement that would allow him to avoid the death penalty, Hatcher provided a detailed account of how Sinclair had hired him to kill Benjamin Carlisle. "He called me on March 15th around 4 p.m., Hatcher testified. He said he had a problem that needed to be handled quickly and quietly. He offered me $100,000 cash to make someone disappear." According to Hatcher's testimony, Sinclair had been specific about his requirements. Carlisle had to be eliminated before he could report his findings to anyone else. The body had to disappear completely. No trace, no evidence, no questions. And Hatcher had to ensure that Carlisle's work was destroyed as well. "I met Carlisle in the parking garage of Continental Trust that evening," Hatcher continued. "I told him that Mr. Sinclair wanted to meet with him privately to discuss his findings. He got in my car willingly. He trusted me because I told him I was working for the bank." The courtroom was silent as Hatcher described driving Carlisle to an abandoned warehouse where he had shot the auditor and then spent the next several hours dismembering the body to make it easier to dispose of. The details were gruesome, clinical, delivered in the flat monotone of a man who had long ago stopped feeling anything about his crimes. Sinclair's reaction to Hatcher's testimony was telling. While his defense attorneys had tried to distance him from the murder, video from the courtroom showed him taking detailed notes, his expression never changing, as if he were listening to a routine business presentation rather than a description of how he had ordered a man's death. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On January 24, 2020, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Robert Sinclair was convicted of 37 federal crimes, including bank fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and murder for hire. Judge Harrison Westbrook sentenced Sinclair to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the financial crimes. "Mr. Sinclair," the judge said during sentencing, "you have betrayed every principle of trust and honor that our financial system depends upon. You have stolen not just money, but lives, the life of Benjamin Carlisle, and the lives of every person whose security was threatened by your crimes." Thomas Hatcher was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for his role in Carlisle's murder. Continental Trust Bank was forced to pay $847 million in fines and penalties and was eventually sold to a larger institution after its reputation was irreparably damaged. Catherine Sinclair divorced her husband while he was awaiting trial, and she was forced to surrender virtually all of their assets to help repay Continental Trust's losses. The house in Greenwich, the yacht, the cars, everything was seized and sold at auction. She now lives in a modest apartment in Ohio, working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, trying to rebuild a life shattered by her husband's crimes. Benjamin Carlisle's family received a $25 million settlement from Continental Trust Insurance Company, but his wife and 2 young children have struggled to find meaning in his death. "Benjamin died because he was good at his job," his widow Sarah said in a statement read at Sinclair's sentencing hearing. "He died because he believed that the truth mattered. Robert Sinclair killed him to protect a lie." The case sent shockwaves through the banking industry and led to significant changes in how financial institutions monitor their own employees' activities. The Carlisle Protocol, as it became known, requires banks to implement independent verification systems for all high-level transactions, making it virtually impossible for a single employee to steal billions of dollars without immediate detection. Today, Robert Sinclair is serving his life sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. He spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, with 1 hour permitted for exercise in a small concrete yard. He has never expressed remorse for his crimes, and according to prison officials, he spends his time writing what he claims is a memoir about his experiences in the banking industry. The memoir will never be published. Federal law prohibits criminals from profiting from books about their crimes, and Sinclair's assets remain frozen as part of the ongoing efforts to recover the stolen funds. Of the $2.347 billion that Sinclair stole from Continental Trust Bank, investigators have recovered approximately $1.8 billion. The remaining $547 million is believed to be hidden in offshore accounts that may never be located. Swiss banking authorities have cooperated with the investigation, but the money trail disappears into a maze of shell companies and encrypted accounts that Sinclair created over 7 years of meticulous planning. Continental Trust Bank ceased operations in December 2020, its 147-year history ending with the liquidation of its remaining assets. The bank's headquarters building in Chicago now houses a technology company, but a small plaque in the lobby commemorates Benjamin Carlisle and the 37,000 Continental Trust employees who lost their jobs when the institution collapsed. The Carlisle family has established a foundation that provides scholarships for aspiring auditors and accountants, ensuring that Benjamin's commitment to financial integrity lives on in others who choose to follow his profession. The foundation's motto, inscribed on a bronze plaque at its headquarters, reads, "The truth always matters." FBI Special Agent Laura Brennan, who led the investigation into Sinclair's crimes, retired in 2022 after 30 years of service. She now teaches criminal justice at Northwestern University, and she often uses the Continental Trust case as an example of how sophisticated financial crimes can be unraveled through careful investigation and attention to detail. Robert Sinclair thought he was smarter than everyone else, Brennan tells her students. He thought he had created the perfect crime. But there is no such thing as a perfect crime. There are only crimes that haven't been solved yet. The case remains one of the largest financial frauds in American history, and its impact continues to reverberate through the banking industry. New regulations require banks to implement multiple layers of oversight for high-level transactions, and auditing firms have developed new techniques for detecting the kind of sophisticated schemes that Sinclair used to hide his crimes. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Continental Trust case is the reminder that trust, once broken, can never be fully restored. The bank's customers, employees, and shareholders lost more than money. They lost their faith in an institution that had been a pillar of their community for nearly a century and a half. Robert Sinclair found $2 billion missing from the bank, then made sure the man who discovered his crime went missing too. But in the end, it was Sinclair himself who disappeared, into a prison cell where he will spend the rest of his life, remembered not as the successful banker he pretended to be, but as the cold-blooded killer who murdered an innocent man to protect his lies. They thought they'd get away, but no one escapes forever. If stories like this fascinate you, tales of corporate greed, financial fraud, and justice finally served, then you're exactly where you belong. Hit that like button if this story left you satisfied that justice was done. Subscribe to join our growing community of viewers who can't get enough of watching the powerful fall, and share this with someone who needs to hear that no matter how untouchable they seem, justice always finds a way. What corporate crime story should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember, they thought they'd get away, but they never do.